Ethan had grown quieter with time, his love retreating behind screens and late-night calls. The home that once carried laughter now felt like an echo chamber where words went to die. She used to wait for him to notice the small things, the fresh flowers on the table, the new haircut, the soft tone she'd used to start a conversation. But all of it went unnoticed, like whispers drowned by silence. Her days had become a pattern of quiet endurance. She'd wake before dawn, make coffee, and stare through the kitchen window as if searching for proof that life still existed beyond her walls. Ethan's jacket hung by the door, his cologne still faint in the air, but he was never really there. Even when he sat across the dinner table, his eyes were fixed on his phone, his answers brief and automatic. The warmth had drained out of his voice years ago, leaving only civility. Clara had stopped asking if something was wrong. The truth was simpler, nothing was wrong, but nothing was right either, Liam noticed before anyone else. He wasn't a boy anymore, not quite a man either, but there was something in his eyes that saw more than she wanted him to. When she smiled too quickly, when her voice trembled while pretending to be fine, he noticed. "You okay, Mom?" he'd ask softly, his tone careful, as if he feared the answer. She'd nod, offer a small smile, and change the subject. But every time he asked, something inside her loosened. It felt strange being cared for again, even in such a small way. In the evenings, when Ethan stayed late at work, she and Liam would watch something light, a show they'd seen before. He'd make popcorn, sit beside her, and tease her gently when she cried at the same parts every time. For a while, she'd forget the hollowness that clung to her chest. His laughter filled the silence Ethan left behind. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't wrong, it was simply human, the comfort of not being invisible. Sometimes she caught herself watching him as he spoke, realizing how much of her he carried, the softness, the patience, the way he listened. When he hugged her goodnight, she felt the warmth she'd been starving for. It frightened her how much that simple gesture could steady her heartbeat. She told herself it was just motherly affection, that it was normal to need closeness. Yet the longer Ethan withdrew, the more those small gestures began to matter. She remembered one evening when Ethan came home early. The lights were dim, Liam was helping her with the dishes, their laughter spilling softly through the kitchen. Ethan stepped in, his brow furrowed. "You two having fun?" he said, his tone sharp but tired. Liam stopped laughing. Clara's hands froze around the plate. She could feel Ethan's disapproval without words, like a shadow filling the room. Later that night, he said nothing about it. He didn't have to. His silence carried judgment. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about how strange it felt to share a house with someone she no longer knew. She remembered their early days. Ethan used to surprise her with notes, with touches, with simple gestures that made her feel seen. Somewhere along the years, all of that had faded, replaced by cold routines and empty bedsides. She used to think time would heal whatever had broken, but time had only deepened the cracks. The next morning, she woke to find Liam making breakfast. He'd burned the toast, but his smile made her laugh. It was rare for her to laugh anymore. "You don't have to do this," she told him. "I wanted to," he said. "You look tired lately." The words were simple, but they hit deep. No one had told her that in years. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes stinging for reasons she couldn't explain. "I'm fine," she whispered, but they both knew she wasn't. As the days passed, their bond became unspoken, a quiet understanding between two people abandoned by the same silence. She began to notice how his presence filled the house in ways Ethan's never did. His laughter softened the edges of her loneliness. When she felt tears rise, he didn't walk away. He listened. Sometimes, he didn't even speak, he just stayed. That kind of stillness was something Ethan could never give her, but beneath that comfort, there was unease. Clara felt it in the way her heart quickened when Liam brushed past her, or how her breath caught when his hand lingered on hers a moment too long while passing a cup of tea. She told herself it was only her imagination, that she was reading too much into simple gestures. Still, guilt began to grow like a quiet weight inside her. She couldn't name it, didn't dare to, but it was there, a boundary trembling on the edge of breaking. That evening, as rain tapped gently against the window, she sat beside him on the couch. The world outside was gray, their reflections faint in the glass. He turned to her, eyes soft, voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to be happy, Mom." The words lingered in the air, fragile, dangerous. She forced a smile, her chest tightening. "I am," she lied. But both of them knew she wasn't. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with a kind of emotion that couldn't be spoken. Clara wanted to reach out, to hug him, to thank him for noticing her when no one else did. But something inside her stopped her hand midair. She folded it back into her lap, feeling the ache of restraint. The clock ticked softly in the background, and for the first time, she realized how fragile love could become when it was starved too long. In that quiet space, between a mother's longing and a son's compassion, something unspoken began to shift, small, invisible, but powerful enough to change everything that would come next. The night felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself carried the weight of everything Clara had been avoiding. Ethan was away again, another business trip that left the house hollow and quiet. She told herself she didn't mind the silence anymore, but it had started to sound like something living, breathing between the walls. She sat alone at the table long after dinner, her fingers tracing the rim of a cold cup of tea. When Liam walked in, his voice was soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. "You haven't eaten," he said. She smiled faintly, her lips barely curving. "I'm not hungry." He didn't leave. Instead, he sat across from her, his eyes watching her with quiet concern. The gentleness in his gaze unsettled her, not because it was wrong but because it was everything she had once needed from her husband. "You look sad," he said. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but something inside her cracked. Her eyes stung as she whispered, "I'm just tired, Liam. That's all." But the lie was too thin to hold. Her voice trembled, her hands shook, and before she could turn away, he stood and placed a hand on her shoulder. The warmth of that simple touch undid her. All the restraint she had built over years of neglect slipped away in a single breath. Tears fell without warning, spilling into her palms as she tried to hide her face. Liam knelt beside her, his arms wrapping around her gently. "It's okay, Mom," he murmured, his voice steady but fragile. She didn't pull away. The hug was long, too long, her grief pouring into him like a confession. It wasn't passion, it was need, raw and desperate, the kind that comes from being invisible too long. When she finally stepped back, she couldn't look at him. Shame filled her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping at her face. "You shouldn't have to see me like this." But Liam only shook his head. "I don't mind," he said softly. "You've always been there for me. I just want to be there for you now." The sincerity in his tone pierced her heart. For years, she had begged silently for those words from Ethan. Hearing them now, from her son, felt both healing and horrifying. The next morning, she tried to act normal, her movements brisk, her tone overly light. But every glance toward Liam carried a pulse of discomfort she couldn't explain. He seemed quieter too, thoughtful in a way that made her uneasy. At breakfast, when their hands brushed as they reached for the same cup, she froze. He noticed. Their eyes met for a brief, charged second before she turned away, pretending nothing happened. "You should get going," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "You'll be late." He hesitated, wanting to say something, but didn't. The silence between them said enough all day. Clara's mind replayed that moment, the touch, the look, the feeling that something irreversible had shifted. She blamed herself for leaning on him too much, for letting her loneliness twist simple comfort into something dangerous. That evening, she avoided him, locking herself in her room under the pretense of work. But she couldn't focus. The guilt sat heavy in her chest, tangled with a strange sorrow she couldn't untangle. She missed him, yet she feared what that meant. When he finally knocked on her door, she didn't answer. He knocked again, quietly. "Mom," he said, his voice muffled, "did I do something wrong?" The question broke her. She opened the door to find him standing there, his expression uncertain, eyes glistening in the dim light. "No, sweetheart," she said quickly, forcing calm into her voice. "You didn't?" He stepped closer, searching her face. "Then why are you avoiding me?" His voice cracked slightly. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Because I'm confused," she said softly. "And that's not your fault." He frowned, his hands tightening at his sides. "I just don't like seeing you hurt," he said. "I hate how he treats you. You deserve someone who actually cares." She tried to smile, but her throat tightened again. "That's not your job, Liam," she said, her voice trembling. "You're my son. You're supposed to live your life, not carry mine." But he didn't move. He looked at her with an intensity that frightened her, a kind of devotion that didn't belong to a child anymore. "Maybe I just care too much," he whispered, her heart pounded in her ears. "Don't say that," she murmured. "Please." But he kept going, his words tumbling out, unguarded and raw. "You're everything to me. You always have been. When Dad ignores you, it makes me so angry. I wish I could take away all of it, the way he makes you feel." She stepped back, her pulse unsteady. "Liam," she said firmly, though her voice shook, "you don't understand what you're saying." He looked at her, his jaw trembling. "I do," he said quietly. "I love you, Mom. More than I should." The world seemed to stop. The ticking clock, the soft hum of the house, all of it disappeared. Clara stood frozen, her breath caught between disbelief and heartbreak. "Don't," she whispered, tears rising again. "Don't say that." But he was already crying too, his face buried in his hands. "I didn't mean to," he stammered. She didn't let him finish. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said quickly, her voice shaking. "You're just confused. We both are." He nodded, stepping back, ashamed, his shoulders trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking. "I shouldn't have said that." She wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. She just stood there, watching him leave the room, the space between them now filled with something they could never take back. When the door closed, Clara sank to the floor, her body shaking with silent sobs. She pressed her palms to her face, whispering to herself as if prayer could undo the moment. "What have I done?" she breathed. She hadn't crossed a line, but she had walked too close to it, so close that even innocence could no longer feel pure. The loneliness that had once felt like her only enemy had now become something darker, heavier, something she could no longer ignore. And though she didn't know it yet, nothing between them would ever be the same again. Every sound made her flinch, the creak of the floorboards, the ticking clock, the faint hum of rain against glass. Her thoughts wouldn't stop circling. She wanted to believe it was just a mistake, a moment of emotion gone wrong, but the words still echoed, "I love you more than I should." They had shattered something inside her, and she couldn't tell if it was fear, shame, or a heartbreak that hurt more. When morning came, she found Liam in the kitchen, staring at a cup of untouched coffee. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders tense, eyes red from crying. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence was no longer comforting, it was suffocating. Finally, she said his name softly, almost afraid of how it might sound. He didn't look up. "I didn't mean it," he said quietly. "I swear I didn't." His voice trembled. It just came out. Clara's heart ached at his guilt. She sat across from him, her hands folded tightly together. "I know you didn't," she said. "You were trying to protect me. But we can't let that happen again." He nodded, his throat tightening as he whispered, "I know." There was so much unsaid between them, years of silence, of emotional hunger, of unspoken care that had twisted into something neither of them wanted. She reached out and placed her hand on his, but this time it wasn't comfort, it was closure. "We're going to be okay," she said, though she didn't yet believe it. The next few days passed in a blur of restraint. Clara avoided eye contact, kept conversations short, tried to fill the house with noise so the silence wouldn't speak for them. She cooked, cleaned, smiled at the neighbors, all while pretending her chest wasn't heavy with guilt. Liam stayed distant but kind, always polite, never lingering too long. It was as if they had both silently agreed to erase that night from existence. But every now and then, when their eyes met accidentally, the memory flickered between them like a shadow. Clara began to question everything: her marriage, her motherhood, her own sense of morality. She wondered if she had failed as a wife first, or as a mother later. The truth was painful. She had been starving for affection, and when she finally found it, she didn't recognize the danger in its form. She blamed herself for not seeing how her loneliness had bled into her son's empathy. "I built this," she whispered to herself one night, her voice cracking. "Every silence, every tear I hid, he learned it from me." She knew she couldn't keep living like this. Ethan came home that weekend, acting as if nothing had changed, unaware of the emotional wreckage his absence had created. Watching him scroll through his phone while she served dinner made her chest burn. She realized then that she no longer feared losing him, she had already lost him long ago. After dinner, she asked him to talk. Her tone was calm but final. "We can't keep pretending," she said. "This isn't a marriage anymore." Ethan looked up, startled, defensive. "What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't flinch. "It means I'm done being invisible." Her words hung in the air, sharper than she intended. For a moment, he tried to argue, blaming her for being distant, for making everything dramatic. But she didn't respond with anger this time. She simply said, "I stopped waiting for you years ago." That silenced him. He left the room without another word. That night, Clara sat by the window, thinking of Liam. Not as the boy who had said something forbidden, but as a child who had grown up watching two people fall out of love and mistake distance for peace. She understood now that what he had said wasn't born out of desire but confusion, a reflection of her pain mirrored in his heart. He had seen her unloved for too long and tried to fill the emptiness the only way he knew how, by giving her the kind of care he never saw his father give. Days turned into weeks. The tension softened into understanding. Clara started therapy, quietly urging Liam to do the same. She told him they both needed to heal, not from each other, but from the silence that had shaped their home. At first, he resisted, embarrassed and afraid, but eventually, he agreed. It was the first honest step either of them had taken in years. Months passed, and though the house remained quiet, the quiet no longer felt like punishment. There was a fragile kind of peace between them now. Ethan had moved out temporarily, saying he needed space, though Clara suspected it was permanent. She didn't chase him. For the first time, she felt free from pretending. Her focus shifted entirely to rebuilding what had almost been lost, the purity of her bond with her son. One afternoon, she found Liam sitting outside, sketching in a notebook. The sun fell softly on his face, and for the first time in months, he looked calm. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He looked up and smiled faintly. "Better," he said. "I'm trying to understand things, you know, what it means to love someone the right way." His voice was steady now, grounded. Clara's throat tightened, but this time with relief. "That's all we can do," she said gently. That evening, she stood by the window again, the same place she had once stared through in despair. The rain returned, soft and steady. But it no longer sounded mournful, it sounded cleansing. She spoke quietly, almost as if to herself. "Sometimes love starves you so long, you forget what real affection looks like. You start mistaking care for connection, comfort for something deeper." She paused, letting the truth settle. But love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's loneliness trying to disguise itself. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, the weight finally lifting from her chest. The guilt hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape, becoming understanding, becoming resolve. She knew now that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened but learning from it. She would spend the rest of her life making sure Liam never carried her pain again. Her final words lingered softly, carried by the rain. "Sometimes, silence in a marriage doesn't just break love, it reshapes it into something unrecognizable. And by the time you realize what you've lost, it's too late to go back. But you can still choose to move forward, and love right this time." The clock ticked quietly in the background. The house, once filled with grief, now breathed differently, lighter, gentler. The storm had passed, but its lesson remained, etched forever in the space between mother and son, where love had been tested, blurred, and finally set free.